We have another terrific panel with another terrific moderator. It's my pleasure to introduce Gail Heriot, who's a professor of law at the University of San Diego. She teaches and writes in the areas of civil rights, employment discrimination, and remedies. And since 2007, she's been a member of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. Earlier in her career, she served as a counsel to the Senate Judiciary Committee and as a professor and dean at George Mason University School of Law. She also serves on the board of the National Association of Scholars and the California Association of Scholars, and she will introduce the panel and moderate. Thank you, Gail.
Good morning, and welcome to the panel on citizenship and identity. For an early explanation of what it is to be an American or an American citizen, turning to Abraham Lincoln isn't a bad idea. He famously said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that unlike most nations, we are not a nation of blood kin. Particularly today, most of us are not descended from the generation that declared its independence from Britain or who forged our constitutional order. We're a nation of many races, ethnicities, and national origins. Lincoln said what binds us together is a common belief in the ideals of the founding generation, a belief in liberty and in a constitutional order. And all of those who hold those ideals are the true heirs of that generation. Or at least Lincoln thought that those ideals bound us together, and he thought that Americans had far more in common than they do separating them from one another, and that these are the things that should be emphasized. We now live in an era in which one's race, sex, ethnicity, and sexual orientation are said to express what is most important about an individual. And where the idea that Americans have in common with each other anything is sometimes scoffed at. This has been an era of identity politics. In a much discussed op-ed in the New York Times written directly after the 2016 presidential election, Mark Lilla, a writer who identifies, as it were, as left of center, expressed what many left of center thinkers had been thinking but fearful of expressing, and what many right of center thinkers had been saying outright. And that is the urge to celebrate our differences, which has been a tenet of standard American liberalism for a generation, may have gotten out of hand at this point. As he put it, in recent years, American liberalism has slipped into a kind of moral panic about racial, gender, and sexual identity that has distorted liberalism's message and prevented it from becoming a unifying force capable of governing. Lilla wrote that the age of identity liberalism must be brought to an end, and that is a direct quote. So was he right? Was he half right? Was he completely off track? We have here three excellent panelists to talk about the phenomenon of identity politics. And there are many questions that might be fruitful for discussion today in this regard. Was the emphasis on our differences always a misstep, or was it something that was necessary? Has it turned out to be a problem, or is it something that should continue? How has growing up in the age of identity politics affected college students today? Basically, has identity politics divided Americans in an unnatural way, and has it caused us to be distracted from what we have in common? Elizabeth Corey is an associate professor of political science and director of the honors program at Baylor University. She is the author of Michael Oakeshott on Religion, Aesthetics, and Politics, and a frequent contributor to periodicals like First Things and National Affairs. Glenn Loury is the Merton P. Stoltz Professor of Economics at Brown University. As an economic theorist, he has been published widely and lectured throughout the world. He has been elected as a distinguished fellow of the American Economics Association. And most important for our purposes, he is among America's leading thinkers on writings on racial inequality. Lucia Martinez Valdivia is an associate professor of English and Humanities at Reed College, where she teaches courses in early modern poetry, poetics, and humanities. She has published pieces on the history and development of English poetry and is currently completing her first book, Common Meter, a revised history of English poetry. She also has found the time to write op-eds for the Washington Post and the Oregonian on topics that are related to today's discussion. So with that, take it away, Dr. Corey.
Thank you, Gail. And of course, a big thanks to Paul and Carol and to everyone here at ASU for inviting me to this event. I began to cultivate an interest in identity politics on the university campus. That's not unusual because I live and work there. I teach at Baylor University. But today we've been asked to think about identity politics from the point of view of the question of citizenship and identity. What is the relationship between personal identity, whatever that might mean, and I'll give some ideas about what that might mean, and one's identity as a citizen? So we might ask the question to start, sort of a foundational question, what is the most important part of a person's identity? Is it being a citizen, being a part of a collective political group? Or is it being part of a family, being a mother, a father, a son or daughter, a brother or a sister? Or is it being part of a group that identifies itself on the basis of some particular common task or trait? A musician, a soccer player, an accountant, or more popularly, of course, today, the categories we all know, a race, a gender, or sexual orientation. Of course, we know that identity consists in all of these things. We are Americans, Canadians, Poles, women and men, children and adults, blue-collar and white-collar workers, Catholics and Jews and Muslims. But I would submit that contemporary identity politics do not take such a capacious view of human identity. Instead, they focus on certain favored categories, and we all know what they are, race, gender, and sexual orientation to start, but there are many others. And of course, these are parts of identity, and even very important parts. But in the contemporary university, for those of you who are at universities or are around universities, you know this, and increasingly in business, arts, and industry, these categories are being used as instruments of power. They're being used as ways of tearing down old hierarchies and building up new ones. Mostly, it seems to me, this is being done by means of the theoretical construct of intersectionality. Most of you here will know what this means, or at least have an idea of what it means, having heard the word. It's kind of a buzzword at the moment. The concept was invented by Kimberly Crenshaw, a legal scholar, in 1989. And what Crenshaw wanted to do was to name a problem that had not been named or been only insufficiently named, because she saw that black women were being discriminated against in ways that intersected. In other words, they were harmed not just because they were black, and not just because they were women. Black women were in a worse position than any white woman or any black man because they had not one but two traits that were deemed less desirable than those people, judged as less desirable because they departed more or less from the identity of white male. So Crenshaw begins this more than 30 years ago. There's an entire industry of intersectionality studies. Intersectionality is used as a lens in almost every major part of the university, in every field. So for intersectional theorists, identity is the product of a set of characteristics: race, class, not so much class, but race, gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, and sometimes others, things like weight, attractiveness, age. In intersectionality, each of these characteristics has a positive or a negative value, and these are designated by convention in a way that anyone familiar with politics can understand. So male is positive, female is negative. For sexual orientation, straight is positive, gay or bisexual or other is negative. And so in general, according to this theory, people exist on a continuum, with straight, able-bodied white men placed at the height of privilege, and perhaps black, disabled, bisexual standing at the low point of oppression. There can be all sorts of other points of oppression. As one scholar of intersectionality notes, she says this: the overarching matrix of domination houses multiple groups, each with varying experiences, with penalty and privilege that produce corresponding partial perspectives and situated knowledges. It goes without saying that, as I just implied, many other identities stand at the low point of oppression, but nobody occupies the height except for white males. White women and black men, no matter how powerful or wealthy, are always disadvantaged in this schema. The problem, or at least one problem I see with this framework, is that it ascribes fixed positive and negative values to each characteristic. Now, it's true, if you read in the work of intersectional theorists, it's not a quantitative methodology. It's not to say, white is +1, black is -1, that yield a score of privilege or oppression. That would be a kind of clunky, not a very good way of understanding intersectionality. Although, if you have interest, there are quizzes you can take on the internet to discover your intersectional score, your intersectional privilege. And it ranges from something like 0 to 100, and if you're 100, you're very, very highly privileged, or maybe it's the other way around, but you should go check these out. But nobody has any doubt about what factors contribute to privilege and oppression. By definition, being female, or not white, or not heterosexual can never be understood as an advantage. So at the same time, the greater the level of oppression, the more seriously a person's views are taken. It is almost a directly inverse relationship. The more privilege one has, as in whiteness or maleness or heterosexuality, the less that person's voice needs to be heard. The assumption is, first, that privilege has already had its positive effect. The person has already had plenty of chances to speak. You've heard this sort of thing. The white men in the room have already had their say. And two, those people, the people with privilege, have aimed not just at advancing their own interests over all these years, but in positively harming those who are unlike them. So privilege needs to be on this understanding and is being redistributed. Note the structural character of this understanding. It isn't that any particular person need be oppressing others, but we're talking here in the aggregate about classes of people, white males, black females, and so on. So what this yields in practice is a kind of hierarchy of power, advantage, platform, that I would submit is profoundly harmful to our common project of citizenship. Intersectionality and identity politics emphasize differences, not similarities, and not a common project. Small and discrete groups, not solidarity. And the implication is that certain people simply cannot enter imaginatively into the experiences of other people. Now, why does this matter so much? This is a brief presentation, so I just want to identify 3 problems that I see with this understanding of identity politics. 2 of them really have to do with the university. And the first has to do with free speech and education, especially in university settings. I would say that intersectionality is profoundly harmful to university education because the presuppositions of the movement are in direct contradiction to the freedom of speech and to things like John Stuart Mill's liberty of thought and discussion that universities have traditionally prized. If you're not a woman or not non-white or not gay, the theory tells us, you cannot imagine what it would be like to be someone who is these things. You cannot speak to my issues. We all know the phrases. People start out by saying, well, as a woman, as a trans person. Anything that begins this way is a de facto closing off of dialogue, because once you've said that, if you're not that, then it's very hard to respond. If you do not possess one of these identities, then you cannot speak to the issue, is the assumption. The notion that you might imaginatively enter into the worlds of people who are unlike you, or that you might approach the intellectual life with a sort of disinterest, both of these seem all but impossible in many quarters of the modern academy. And I have had students say, yeah, you can't do this anymore. So let me talk for just a minute about this idea of disinterest. What do I mean by disinterest? I think the very idea of disinterest has pretty much fallen out of favor in modern university education. Most people don't know what the word means. When you say disinterest, people think, well, you mean I'm not interested in that. But then the words disinterest and not interested or uninterested are not synonyms. Uninterested implies a lack of interest altogether, while disinterest is an attentive, engaged interest in something that is not essentially related to the self. I may have a disinterested interest in medieval art history or in the origins of the common law, but these things don't affect me directly, nor I them. Disinterest implies personal detachment from the subject in question, as well as objectivity about one's findings. And for a long time, this notion of disinterest was really central to the mission of universities. Recall John Henry Newman's statements of the aims of liberal education. He said, the aims were a cultivated intellect, a delicate taste, a candid, equitable, dispassionate mind, a noble and courteous bearing in the conduct of life. And I would say that disinterest is a crucial part of the education that fosters these characteristics. Today, by contrast, as many of us know, large portions of the university encourage strikingly different kinds of character traits. Whatever administrators may say about liberal learning, the two most widespread aims of universities in the present day seem to be, without a doubt, the interests of career preparation or a kind of social justice. Job seekers in an interview might still be well served by exhibiting Newman's ideal traits, but delicacy and dispassion are not effective in contemporary social justice work, which requires opposed traits: passion, steadfastly pursued, devotion to a chosen cause, self-assurance in action. I was incidentally amused to see a poster at the top of the stairs at ASU, where we walk up over around the corner, with a list of imperatives for ASU as the new American university. There were 8 points, and I'll read them to you. Leverage our place, transform society, value entrepreneurship, conduct use-inspired research, enable student success, fuse intellectual disciplines, be socially embedded, and engage globally. I see no mention of dispassion or disinterest in these imperatives. And this is typical. In a similar vein, if universities are not relentlessly practical, many university professors see their academic work as a species of activism where to teach is to transgress. To them, disinterest seems at best effete and dilettantish. At worst, it is a veiled form of oppression. If it's possible at all, say critics of disinterest, it is a luxury that can only be cultivated by those who already possess power and privilege. But let us imagine the goods that might come with a recovery of this sort of disinterest, not just for education, but also for citizenship. In the 17th and 18th centuries, disinterest was understood as, quote, an opposite of interest, as a positive quality opposed to the exclusive rights and claims of private interest and judgment. To be disinterested was to recognize a public interest or good beyond self-interest, and to be able to judge impartially between our own interests and the interests of others. So like Adam Smith's impartial spectator, the disinterested person aims at seeing his interests alongside those of others. He tries to overcome or temper the natural self-regard that comes with being human. In so doing, he learns restraint, temperance, and self-control. Old-fashioned virtues, indeed, and in short supply in contemporary discourse. So all this talk about disinterest leads me to the second point I want to identify, or the problem that I see with contemporary identity politics, and especially in the intersectional understanding. Identity politics incline us to see ourselves as the center of everything. All things are measured by how they relate to me, or how they are relevant to my life. And so we have the numerous kinds of studies fields. But one of my undergraduates said to me recently, we were discussing this, and she said, I want to be able to study things that aren't only related to me. In other words, I want to be able to study history, philosophy, things that have existed long before me and that will exist long after me. And my identity does not necessarily bear on those things. I want to set my identity aside. I mean, you can never set an identity fully aside, but I want to set it aside so that I can enter fully into the views of people who are very foreign to me. But as Susan McWilliams-Barnes said yesterday, the aim of good citizenship is to see outside our partial and narrow preferences. I would say that our partial and narrow preferences are what identity politics and intersectionality encourage us to see. Finally, 3, there is an implicit kind of moral determinism in this world where a limited set of identity characteristics define us. After the last election, maybe some of you heard this, Michelle Obama said that any woman who voted against Hillary Clinton voted against her own voice. I found this profoundly patronizing, and it seemed to me as if she thought that all women think the same things or should. The problem with this is that it scripts us. It scripts people. People who play these assigned scripts and keep to them are rewarded, while those who don't are unrepresentative, inauthentic, or even self-hating, or possessed of a certain kind of false consciousness. Or they have internalized, people like this have internalized their oppressors and have taken their views, as if our minds have been infiltrated by some kind of alien force, and we can no longer think clearly or for ourselves. So a conservative black man is seen as a traitor. Pro-life women are accused of hating women because they do not support the mainstream idea of reproductive rights. We see these kinds of things often, and it is a kind of denial of individual understanding and agency. But I would say this is an artificial prioritization of certain aspects of identity. We must have the freedom to understand ourselves as we choose, so that the most important part of my identity might not be that I am a white woman or that or any number of these particular intersectional characteristics, but that I'm a daughter or a wife or a sister or a mother or a Southerner, things that don't map onto the intersectional project. I might even choose to identify myself not as any of these things, but as a citizen. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. In these remarks, I will address the historical fact of Black subordination in America and its implications for the nature of American citizenship. The priority of informal social relations before formal economic transactions is my theme. If you detect here an echo of yesterday's panel on Locke, Rousseau, and liberalism, that's no accident. It's a feature, not a bug. But don't worry, I will not be masquerading as a political theorist. Rather, I will draw on my many years of study as economist and public intellectual to briefly make two observations. One about the dynamics of human development, and the other about the foundations of racial identity. Why, I want to ask, the success of the civil rights movement notwithstanding, has a subordinate status of Black Americans persisted into the 21st century? Clear thinking about this intractable problem requires one to distinguish the role played by discrimination against Black people from the role of counterproductive patterns of behavior that can be found among some Blacks. Now, I admit, this puts what is a very sensitive issue starkly. Many vocal advocates for racial equality refuse even to consider the possibility that problematic behavior could be an important factor contributing to our persistent disadvantaged status. At the same time, some observers on the right of American politics insist that anti-Black discrimination is no longer an important determinant of unequal social outcomes. I have tried to chart a middle course, acknowledging anti-Black biases that should be remedied, but insisting on the imperative of addressing and reversing behavior patterns that prevent some Blacks from seizing newly opened opportunities. These two positions can be recast as causal narratives. Under the bias narrative, one argues that racism and white supremacy have done us wrong, we can't get ahead until they relent, so we must continue urging reform of American society toward that end. Under the development narrative, one emphasizes the need to consider how people come to acquire those skills, traits, habits, and orientations that foster an individual's successful participation in American society. To the extent that Black youngsters do not have the experiences, are not exposed to the influences, and do not benefit from the resources that foster and facilitate their human development, to that extent, they will fail to achieve their full human potential. It is this lack of development, according to this narrative, that ultimately causes the stark racial disparities in income, wealth, education, family structure, and much else to persist. Now, of course, these two narratives need not be mutually exclusive, but in terms of prescribing intervention and remedy, they point in very different directions. The bias narrative urges us to have a conversation about race. White America must reform itself. racism must end. We need more of this or that, whatever the this or that is on the agenda of today's social justice warriors. One can hear this kind of talk and read these exhortations in the newspaper and other media every day. By contrast, the development narrative puts more onus on the responsibilities of African Americans to develop our human potential. It is not satisfied with wishful thinking like, if we could only double the budget for some social program, the homicide rate among young black men would be less atrocious. Or like, if we can just get this local police department investigated by the US Department of Justice, then, well, the development narrative asks, then what? It'll become safe to walk on the south side of Chicago after midnight? This social scientist finds that kind of expectation extremely dubious. So, what are my two observations? A long time ago, over 4 decades ago, in my doctoral dissertation at MIT, I had the good fortune to coin the term social capital. I did so by way of contrasting my concept, social capital, with what economists call human capital. As you may know, human capital theory imports into the study of human inequality an intellectual framework which had been developed primarily to explain investment decisions by firms. This is a framework that focuses the analysis on formal economic transactions. In my thesis, I argued that this framework was inadequate to the problem of accounting for social inequality by race. Allow me to explain. My fundamental point was that associating business with human investments is merely an analogy, not an identity, particularly if one seeks to explain persistent racial disparities. Business investments are transactional. Human investments are essentially relational. So, important things are overlooked in the human capital framework, things having to do with informal social relations. Perhaps one can see now why I mentioned the contrast between Locke and Rousseau. Human capital theory is incomplete when it comes to explaining racial disparities, I argued. There were two central aspects of this incompleteness, and thus my two observations about the dynamics of human development and the nature of racial inequality. First, I stress that all human development is socially situated and mediated. That is, the development of human beings occurs inside social institutions. It takes place as between people by way of human interaction. The family, community, school, peer group, these cultural institutions of human association are where development is achieved. Resources essential to human development, the attention that a parent gives to her child, for instance, are not alienable. Developmental resources, for the most part, are not commodities. The development of human beings is not up for sale. Rather, structured connections between people create the context within which developmental resources come to be allocated to individual persons. Opportunity travels along the synapses of these networks. People are not machines. Their productivities, which is to say, the behavioral and cognitive capacities bearing on their social and economic functioning, are not merely the result of a mechanical infusion of material resources. Rather, these capacities are the byproducts of social processes that are mediated by networks of human affiliation and connectivity. This was fundamentally important, I thought, and still think, for understanding persistent racial disparities in America. That was the first point I wanted to make all those years ago about the incompleteness of human capital theory. My second observation was that what we are calling race in America is mainly a social and only indirectly a biological phenomenon. The persistence across generations of racial differentiation between large groups of people in an open society where individuals live in close proximity to one another provides irrefutable indirect evidence of a profound separation between the racially defined networks of social affiliation in that society. Put directly, there'd be no races in the steady state of any dynamical social system unless, on a daily basis, and in regard to their most intimate affairs, people paid assiduous attention to the boundaries separating themselves from racially distinct others. Over time, race would cease to exist unless people chose to act in a manner so as biologically to reproduce the variety of phenotypic expression that constitutes the substance of racial distinction. I cannot overemphasize this point. Race is not something given in nature. Rather, it is socially produced. It is an equilibrium outcome. It is something we are making. It is endogenous. It follows that if the goal is to understand the root of durable racial inequality, we will need to attend in some detail to the processes that cause race to persist as a fact in the society under study, because such processes almost certainly will not be unrelated to the allocation of developmental resources in that society. Here then is my second observation in a nutshell. The creation and reproduction of racial inequality as a social reality in any society rests on cultural conceptions about identity that are embraced by people, blacks and whites alike in America, in that society. These are the convictions people affirm about who they are and about the legitimacy of conducting intimate relations with racially distinct others. And here I do not only mean sexual relations. My impulse to contrast human and social capital all those years ago was rooted in my conviction that beliefs of this kind ultimately determine the access that people enjoy to the informal resources required to develop their potential. What I called social capital in 1976 was, on this view, a critical prerequisite for creating what economists refer to as human capital. This point is crucial, I believe, if we are to understand persistence of racial inequality in America. But what, you are asking yourselves, has this to do with identity and citizenship? Please bear with me. Historically oppressed groups, time and again, have evolved notions of identity that cut against the grain of their society's mainstream. A culture can develop among them that inhibits talented youngsters from taking the actions needed to develop that talent. Now, given such a situation, I wish to ask, do these kids in dysfunctional peer groups simply have the wrong utility functions? I hold that it is a mistake, a moral mistake and a mistake in social science, to attribute the dysfunctional behavior of an historically oppressed group of people to their simply having the wrong preferences, when those preferences have emerged from a set of experience that reflect the larger society's social structures and activities. Another way of saying this is that when asking about group disparities, social relations come before economic transactions. When ethnic communities and their local cultures are not integrated across boundaries of race in a society, then racial inequality can persist. The persistence of racial disparities derives not simply from discrimination, but more fundamentally from the complex, morally ambiguous, and difficult to regulate phenomena that embody and reflect what people see as the meanings giving significance to their lives, and from the structures of social connectivity to which those meanings give rise. All of this leads me to an important conclusion. How a diverse society answers the question, who are we, is a fundamentally significant issue. It is certainly an important question in the United States today. Who are we? Whose country is it? When we talk about crime, violence, school failure, urban decay, and so on, are these matters in the back of our minds that we understand as us against them? Because if it's us against them, anything is possible. It becomes possible to say about those people languishing in the ghettos of our great cities, that's not my country, that's some third world thing. This was actually said during the flood of New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina in 2005, but it's a lie. Black people in New Orleans have been there for 250 years. They're not aliens. They're as American as you can get, as American as anybody can be. That was us down there crawling over the rooftops. That was us huddled in the Superdome. That was us. My point is that these problems are a quintessentially American affair, not simply a measure of the inadequacy of Black culture. They reflect on our social inadequacy, I wish to argue. And I buttress that argument by observing the incompleteness of human capital theory, by insisting that human development processes are socially contextualized, and by stressing the foundational role race has played in America in all of this. This is what I mean when, being an economist, I nevertheless insist on placing relations before transactions. Let me conclude. Consider the poor central city dwellers who make up perhaps a quarter to a third of the African American population. The dysfunctional behavior of many in this population is a big part of the problem here. So conservatives' demand for greater personal responsibility in these quarters is both necessary and proper. And yet, confronted with the despair, the violence, the self-destructive folly of so many people, it is morally and intellectually superficial in the extreme to argue, as many have done, that those people should just get their acts together like the poor immigrants. If they did, we wouldn't have such a terrible problem in our cities. To the contrary, any morally astute response to the social pathology of American history's losers should conclude that while we cannot change our ignoble past, we need not and must not be indifferent to contemporary suffering that issues directly from that past. Their culture may be implicated in their difficulties, but then so too is ours, complicit in their troubles. We bear collective responsibility for the form and texture of our social relations. Thus, while we cannot ignore the behavioral problems of the so-called underclass, we should discuss and react to them as if we were talking about our own children, our own neighbors, and our own friends, which is to say, this is an American tragedy. It is a national, not simply a communal disgrace. Changing the definition of the American we is a first step toward rectifying the relational discrimination that afflicts our society. And this will require adjusting ways of thinking on all sides of the racial divide. Ultimately, we need to get beyond race, and as Dr. King prophetically envisioned, to ground our civic discourses in an unwavering commitment to transracial humanism. Achieving a society where all members are thought of as being us should be the goal. This, I claim, is the principal implication of placing relations before transactions when thinking about the privileges and duties of American citizenship. It is a position with which I expect both John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau could agree. Thank you.
Good morning. I hope there won't be too many. I think there's some echoes and overlaps that are going to be productive in conversation with both what Elizabeth and what Glenn have said. Hopefully it won't seem too reductive at this point, what I'm going to say about identity, but here goes anyways. So I suspect, again, I'm an English professor, right? So I'm not an economist, I'm not a social scientist, I'm not a political scientist, I'm not a law professor. I'm sort of a little bit outside of the general field of discourse so far. But I suspect I've been asked to join to give a little bit of arts and letters-oriented color to the proceedings. And because, although I'm a bit of an identity politics skeptic, I have nonetheless found ways to manipulate the idea of identity to make it productive in my classrooms rather than allowing it to become destructive, as it can so often do. Today, I'm actually going to keep my focus on higher ed, but I think with a bit of luck, I think that the lessons it can offer to people interested in American civic life and American political life will become clear. So I want to just start with something that I think a lot of you in this room, maybe all of you in this room will have experienced, which is the process of applying to college. Right? Before students arrive on any of our college campuses, they're asked to think about and foreground an identity. Right? College applications demand that you check a box here, that you check a box there, that you provide the institution with a way of sorting you into demographic groups. Right? Do you identify as female or male or gender neutral? Would you prefer not to say? Right? In which case you're in a group of people who prefer not to say. Are you Asian? Are you non-white? Are you a mix of 2 or 3 of those categories? Are you first generation? Are you low SES? Right? Show us the group identity to which you belong, and then please write an essay proving to us that you are an individual who is not a member of a group. Right? welcome to college, right? Then, once we accept you and you arrive on campus, we will promptly sort you into orientation seminars based on a single identity affinity group, like race, like sexuality, like gender, like religion, like socioeconomic status, right? And I'm speaking here from my experience as somebody who teaches at a small elite liberal arts college. I think this generally holds true for elite universities and colleges. I'm curious as to I went to Florida State as an undergraduate, so I had a similar sort of large experience, and I didn't experience what students are experiencing today, and I'm curious as to maybe what some of the students have experienced here at ASU. So as I keep talking, keep thinking. So over the past several years, in the context that I'm familiar with, I've heard identity and belonging come to dominate faculty conversations with student services professionals, discussions about the students I teach and the relationships that they have with the schools they attend. How, faculty are asked, can we make our students feel that they belong in our classrooms? How can a student who fits into a given identity group, a minority identity, sense that they belong, right? And they ask these questions because the students are coming to them with a sense of not belonging in whatever classroom, right? And these are students who are generally politically aligned with their faculty. So that sort of, oh, my faculty member thinks politically in a different way than I do, that's sort of off the table for places like Reed College. The word I haven't heard in any of these conversations is identities, plural. Right? And this matters because, as I think has been clearly pointed out, none of us has a single identity, right? We're each a sort of particular matrix of identities unique to us, identities that intersect to create not only oppressions, but to create a multifaceted and particular individual. And this is true whether or not we wish to have those identities. For as much as we choose to be conscious of and enact any particular identity, the perceptions of others also project them onto us. Right? These various identities are dynamic, dependent on our being able to sense difference. And they're thrown into relief, these identities are thrown into relief by the social situations in which we find ourselves, whether those situations are immediately physically or they are imaginative. Right? So walking around Peru, I'm not viewed by other people, nor do I think of myself as brown or Spanish speaking, right? Because most of the people surrounding me have a similar skin tone, and they're also speaking Spanish. Instead, in that context, I think of myself and I'm perceived as being unusually tall. Or if I fall into conversation with somebody about religion, I become an atheist in comparison to everybody else, right? By contrast, in liberal and outdoorsy Portland, Oregon, where I live now, I'm not conscious of being an atheist or a lesbian. Instead, I'm self-consciously aware of high heels, a haver of brown skin, because I am absolutely in the minority in both of those categories there, right? And so everybody wears chacos and tivas and fleece and are very happy about it, so good for them. So were we to imagine a society with a uniform political ideology, its citizens confined to themselves would likely not be aware of that uniformity of ideology, right? Instead, it would seem like an absolute truth and the natural state of affairs, right? How can you sense uniformity if you have no difference against which to contrast it? Put very simply, context matters. It affects not only the identities we activate, but the importance we attach to them in any given time and space, and whether or not we feel an activity or role has an identity, right? A trait, skin color, religion, political belief, sports team affiliation, a trait only seems to become a conscious identity when it encounters and is thrown into relief by difference. It's in the moments of encountering difference that the trait becomes an identity, that terminology starts emerging. Right? And the emergence of terms, of labels, is in fact, I think, a very good symptom of that transformation from trait to identity. A shorthand that makes it clear that, for example, a group of people sharing a room go from being people in a room to being us. That us being defined by an encounter with or an awareness or threat of them. Our different identities mean and matter more or less to us and more or less to other people in different contexts. And that is, unsurprisingly, because we like to think of ourselves as unique, as individual, as different from others. This self comes to identify through establishing boundaries between itself and other people. Right? We look for difference because it's through that process that we learn to say, sort of as children, I, not you, right? Us, not them. The self's instinct to look for difference and position itself sort of as antagonist to an other is just that. It's an instinct, right? And inherently, this isn't a bad thing at all because it's the mechanism by which we develop senses of ourselves as individuals distinct from other people, senses of ourselves which help us become independent and critical thinkers. It's necessary to a healthy polity, whether that polity be a nation or a college campus. However, when we encourage students to see themselves as members of a group that is antagonistic to or antagonized by, that's other to or othered by another group, we run the hazard of asking them to choose and even to create sides. This can and has closed them off socially and intellectually, fostering division rather than connection, not only between students and their peers, but between students and the institutions they attend. And this goes doubly if those individuals who will form the would-be group are asked to create or participate in, as Elizabeth pointed out, a hierarchy of identities in which some are seen as more valuable or less intrinsic to the community than other identities. But there is, I think, potentially a solution, and there is one identity that can never do this, that can never cut students off from one another or from a sense of belonging in an institution of higher education. What we as educators and as administrators have often failed to communicate is that when these people, these students, walk into a classroom or a library or a professor's office, every student has an identity that means that deeply and essentially they belong exactly where they are. They're learners. And there are two possible objections to this, and I'm going to walk through them. So some people might think of learner as a role or action that somebody does, right, rather than an identity. But often, an action can become something that we feel very really as an identity. Practicing the violin at home, I don't think of myself as a violinist, right? I'm just somebody struggling in a room, feeling a lot of pain and unhappiness. But put me in an audience at the symphony, that action of playing the violin, and I'm in the audience here, right, not on stage, that action feels like and becomes an identity, one through which I can relate to or judge musicians based on my expertise, an identity that appears to me in part because I'm considering myself and thinking of myself in contradistinction to the rest of the audience and my imagined perception of the audience's relative lack of violin expertise, right? And second objection, to others among you, this learner statement might seem painfully obvious. You probably assume, as I did as an undergraduate nearly 2 decades ago, that a college student attends college primarily to learn. But given the various pressures young Americans face, the various ways in which they haven't been prepared to handle them, the ways in which we seem increasingly to be living in an aggregate state of crisis, this simple fact and identity, a student is a learner, has come to need explicit articulation and explanation in those first weeks of college. Vocabulary is crucially important to marking identity categories, but also to reifying them, to making them real. It is through vocabulary that we find an easily articulated and legible sense of self or of community. What we need to tell students is by virtue of choosing to be here right now, you've chosen to say that you are first and foremost a learner, someone who doesn't know all the answers, who wants to think critically about the ideas you encounter. And in the classroom, you're part of a group of people who all have that hope and that humility in common. Recognizing and activating a shared identity is the necessary canvas against which diversity and differences of opinion and ideas can then be expressed, can flourish productively, can communicate across rather than against our various boundaries of being. And this isn't a request, by the way, that students sort of efface their other identities. It simply asks that temporarily, intentionally, when they enter a classroom, they foreground a specific identity that will provide common ground, to provide the connection from which diversity can foster a richness and complexity of experience and knowledge. I've spent a lot of time leading up to today brainstorming whether or not there's any such term or label that might work for political issues rather than for higher education. But I think that in doing so, I was buying into a fiction against which I've fought, and one that I try to sort of remember to fight always, which is the fiction that what happens on college campuses is somehow unrelated to civic life. It isn't. Right? Of course it isn't. These are the institutions that educate our citizens, our future representatives, our future voters. And to think about citizenship and identity as part of the college experience is also to think about that structure in the wider world. I think the scenes currently playing out on elite college campuses can also serve, for those of us on the left, as a sort of canary in a coal mine, right? What Mark Lilla predicted for the future of the American left has come true on elite, typically left-leaning American college campuses. Motivated by ideological commitments to the protection of the individual, to the protection of minorities, to the underrepresented, these colleges have designed student life strategies, what we might think of as campaign strategies or electoral strategies, that foreground those commitments and that have left their minority and underrepresented students feeling fundamentally and irrevocably other relative to the cultural majority on campus. Yes, these students' identity categories are being highlighted for them, being acknowledged, but the result is not students who feel part of the community, but who feel excluded or included by it. And that might seem innocuous, right? What could possibly be bad about being included? But if we frame our community building stances as inclusive, we imply that the people being included are not already fundamentally part of that group, that they need to be granted inclusion. They need to be invited to join by some other sort of body of which they're not naturally a part. Again, what Lilla predicted for the politics of the American left has already played out in the institutions that arguably best mirror its mindset and will produce its future leaders. There's already been a break between progressive ideology and its recruitment rhetoric, and it's proving disastrous for those progressive institutions. These colleges are really finding themselves in a lot of trouble, and they are bleeding the students that they worked so hard to try to recruit. They're not staying. They're abandoning the party, right? They're abandoning the campus. What we have to do is to find a rhetorical strategy that foregrounds shared identity, which for college students, it could and should be learner. For the American left, I hope we come up with a good answer at some point before November. And for the nation, for its people, I don't know. I was watching TV last night, getting ready for bed, and a commercial came on for the American census. And it was all sort of using the vocabulary of community in very lovely ways. And then the tagline that it closed with was, support your community, support your future. I think that's misguided. It should be our community. It should be our future, right? Thank you.
First thing I want to do is allow the panelists to comment on each other if they have anything they would like to say.
I would. I don't know that it's a question, but Liz, I was just struck by, what was the phrase you used? You said that students are struggling with the process of entering imaginatively into the perspectives of other people, right? That's kind of one of the things that intersectionality sort of helps create a wall against. And I was just struck by that because that's the whole point, at least as far as I understand it in my home discipline of English. That's the point of humanist study. It's to enter into other perspectives, right? It's not to sort of find a mirror to see ourselves reflected somewhere. It's in fact to sort of look outside of ourselves. And so when I sit down to read a novel, it's not because I want to find myself in it. I already know who I am, right? But instead because I'm saying that there is value to understanding somebody else's experience. There is a sort of exercise in empathy that takes place when we do that kind of reading. And that is something that in my experience in the classroom, right, I teach lyric poetry, and so students say, like, they read Sappho saying, oh, I love you, and they're like, yes, I get it, I relate to that, right? And I'm like, no, that's not the point. The point is not that you relate to that, right? The point is, how is that sense of being able to relate being constructed grammatically, right? How are you being tricked into associating with thing on the page, right? And I think we need more of that, frankly. And yeah, again, not a question, but just thank you for saying that.
Yeah, I agree with, is this on? I agree with what you say, and I think that is actually what all traditional liberal arts study has been about. I mean, insofar as you read a work that is not immediately accessible to you, say you're reading Homer's Odyssey, I mean, you are being asked to enter into a world that's quite foreign from your own, and getting good at that seems to me to be kind of what it's about. I mean, John Stuart Mill has it in the liberty of thought and discussion. You know, he who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that. I mean, it's very much, this is all throughout the tradition. But insofar as we say, well, I can't read Mill because he was a white man and I don't share his presuppositions, well, then you've missed that point. And I think that's what identity studies can encourage us to do.
Okay, then I am inviting students especially to come forward, but while we're waiting for that, I've got a question for the panel. I tend to think a lot of this is driven by the legal system. And that, you know, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, the Civil Rights of 1964 was a great achievement, but it causes people to think in terms of race and sex, certain affirmative action programs, even more so. You know, it pays if you are a woman-owned business to think in terms of being a woman and being entrepreneurial as a woman. But people look at me sometimes and say, well, you're a lawyer, you're a law professor, of course you think that way. You know, plumbers think that everything is plumbing, and dentists think everything is teeth. But none of you is a lawyer or a law professor, so if you have any comment on that, I'd appreciate that.
Well, I'll say this much. I mean, I think there is a deep kind of conundrum, which is to classify is to create, call attention to the categories in question. But administration does require some classification. You gave the example of anti-discrimination law. On the one hand, I've got people sorting themselves or employers sorting their employees into these categories in order to demonstrate that they're not discriminating or to provide the data necessary for the government to monitor their employment practices, because I want to stop discrimination. On the other hand, I now have created a context, a legal environment in which it invites people to see themselves in the very categories that I wish were less emphasized. I don't really see a way around that conundrum. It's a management, you can manage it, but I don't see how you can escape it.
Well, the only thing I would say is that, I mean, it's probably clear to everybody that I'm being critical of intersectionality, but the impetus for Kimberly Crenshaw was a legal case where women who were working for General Motors black women who were working for General Motors were being treated in a way that couldn't be captured by their being women or by their being black. And they were arguing, actually, the only way you can capture the discrimination that we've experienced is to understand us as a class of black women. And the court rejected that and said that would open a Pandora's box of all sorts of identity claims. But that is a real thing. If a class of black women is being treated unfairly by the law, then that ought to be remedied. So I think the initial understanding of intersectionality makes a lot of sense.
Hi. So bringing this back to politics, I would like to kind of understand your guys' remedy potentially to the identity crisis. I think, though I agree that identity does divide us, especially on a college campus or within politics, it's still hard to remove the fact that there is inequality and disadvantage for these groups of people, and that by removing the identity for those, you're also at the same time removing the disadvantage that they face. We see this with racism and sexism and how this actually correlates with politics today and policy and decisions among those. So how would you remedy those issues while also fixing the division of identity, the idea between equity versus equality and how we fix the issues that these people are at a disadvantage of, but also moving forward?
I mean, I think one of the problems is that and this is Mark Lilla's point, is that what makes for a good and valuable and inclusive ideology does not necessarily make good electoral rhetoric, right? That's sort of precisely, on the left at least, because we are so inclusive. If we start providing a laundry list of the identities in our rhetorical strategies, right, in our electoral strategies, if we start saying we include X and Y and Z, then, I don't know, L, M, and N are going to know why they weren't mentioned in the speech, right? And so this is really about a sort of what rhetorical strategy, and again, English professor showing, right? Like how can we manipulate language to make people feel that they are part of a shared group and trust that that sort of shared group will keep an interest in those sort of individual and minority and disadvantaged sort of identity groups.
Okay, I'm going to say something provocative. I mean, because we have a lot of choices, and I think there's some low-hanging fruit. To wit, I would say all lives matter, not Black Lives Matter. I would not say Black Lives Matter. Now, it's way too late. The horse is out of the barn. I'm not going to turn this around by anything I say here right now, and I'm only going to get myself in trouble, but hear me out. Why would you gratuitously call attention to racial categories in the context of a discussion of crime, policing, and punishment when African American offending rates are so vastly disparately high? Why would you do that? The number of people killed by police officers in this country may be too great, over 1,200 a year. Half of those people or more are white. A quarter of them are black. If there's an issue with policing, it's entirely possible to frame a political campaign against it in transracial, humanistic terms. Police should be accountable. They should be better trained. They shouldn't be armed in these situations. The protocols should be different. The law should be changed. You don't have to frame that as a racial claim. It invites a kind of dishonest discourse, a kind of one-sided discourse, which some conservatives exploit. You know, you turn on Sean Hannity and you're going to hear him talking about black-on-black crime, because there is black-on-black crime, and there's black-on-white crime. Look at the statistics. So we have an above-the-table conversation, Black Lives Matter, racial discrimination, unarmed black men, and then we have a below-the-table conversation, which is what the reality of social disorder in the country actually looks like. Why advocates of the interests of African Americans or the interests of social justice would want to frame this discourse in racial terms escapes me. It's a mistake.
So in reference to McLaren's 2017 survey, which labeled ascriptive and civic identity, and said that civic identity increased public trust, and ascriptive labels, so ethnicity and place of birth, lowered public trust. Do you think that college campuses are a effective place to train a civic identity and therefore increase public trust, considering that they are the place where people are most likely to have higher social capital later in their life? Or do you think that that will, I guess, taint the, as you mentioned, the individual's identity?
Is that for me or for the panel? Please say it's for the panel.
Sorry,
Okay.
for everyone, broadly, everyone.
Okay, I'll say something. I mean, and I'll be very brief, because I want to identify with this idea that what students have in common is that they have this remarkable opportunity, this privilege. It's an amazing privilege, being able to spend years on end simply studying and learning. That they have in common. You're not going to be the same after that as before. If you frame that enterprise in terms of what you were when you came in, you've missed out on something really important, because you don't know who you are until you've read those books. So this is what I tell my kids, my advisees. I'm a freshman advisor at Brown. I tell them, hold your fire, chill out, be cool. Take some stuff all around and then begin to think about the identity question, because you don't know who you are.
Well, and it's when you encounter those different voices in those books, right? Again, if difference is the thing through which we establish a sense of ourselves, then it's precisely, yes, in reading those books that you will come out with a better and more coherent sense of self than you entered into the project with.
And what a tremendously exhilarating intellectual journey that is, this sense of self-discovery, rather than being boxed in, having people on the outside tell you who you are and then walk around with these rigid categories inflexibly, channeling what you read and what you learn based upon something that you brought in the door with you rather than what's on the table in front of you.
Yeah, I don't know if, well, I'm sure a lot of people are out there are parents, and if you know your 17 or 18-year-old, the idea that that person knows his or her identity fully at the point you enter university is ridiculous. The point of liberal learning, I think, is to discover what that is. And so that's why I would object to so many of the kind of grievance studies programs, because once you sort of declare yourself as part of those, then you're learning in a very, very narrow way what is held by a particular political ideology. And you're not seeing those other sides. You're not reading the great books. You're just sort of honing your ideological skills that you thought you had when you came in with the particular identity you had. So I think that's extremely dangerous. That's an extremely dangerous part of contemporary universities, because just what you were saying, especially orientation programs that encourage you to identify as an X or a Y, and then to be shuffled off into that groups for that special orientation. That to me is very counterproductive, but it happens all the time.
Okay. Thank you.
My name is Cassidy Moore, and I'm a student here at ASU who's also LGBT, a woman, disabled, and well, I haven't taken the intersectionality quiz yet, so maybe I have more to add to that. And as this topic is important to me, I was interested in Dr. Corey's point on closing off conversations and how starting conversations with, as a woman, as an LGBT member, as a Catholic, it can close off people from these interactions. And my question to the panel is, how do you suggest opening up this dialogue that is specific to certain identities and the discriminations they face to people who may not have the same identities?
I think first of all is not to start with as a woman, or whatever it is, because there's a way in which I've been in many meetings where people will start that way and then everyone will sit quietly. Because you feel like, well, I don't share that identity and this person has put this forth as the most important part of what they want to say. It stymies conversation altogether. So that's just kind of a tip. I mean, but of course, there are ways in which you can talk about these things that are not immediately offensive or defend. There's a sense in which you think you're kind of defending your identity. I think it is the cultivation of certain virtues of charity and humility. It's not particularly helpful for the particular question you're asking, but those would help.
I mean, I think to think about that a little bit differently, I think it can be more complicated than that, because there are moments when those facts of identity can come in handy to help you be heard accurately, right? And so in my case, I think a lot of people who maybe would read my ideas and not know who wrote them would immediately dismiss them on the basis of identity, and they would assume that they were written by an old white man, right? And so then I never preface with as a woman, but sometimes I do have to make the point that the only reason anyone is listening to me and the only reason anyone is valuing anything of what I have to say is because I am gay, because I am brown, and because I am a woman, and because I'm young, right, relatively. And that is, frankly, to me, offensive. But if that's what it takes to get people to listen to my ideas, so if I do that, I always say, now it's a problem that you care about that you need that in order to listen to me. And so what I want you to do is to treat me as you would anybody who didn't belong to those categories and listen to those ideas on their own merits. Right?
Thank you.
Hello, thank you all. My name is Desmond Kumi. I'm a junior minoring in SCETL. I had kind of a two-parter quick questions for Dr. Elizabeth Corey. Firstly, I just want to thank all three of you for extending my vocabulary. I've learned a couple of terms. This one pertains more towards disinterest, concept of being engaged in concepts or matters that don't directly impact you per se. Oftentimes, especially in junior high, we'll be having conversations, things that are more geared towards contemporary items. And usually when I go to speak and stuff, people tell me, you don't have the room to talk about this. As if you have no say in this, or you shouldn't have a voice or opinion in this because this doesn't affect you. Being a student now, trying to dive into different categories and different topics that could affect me or significant others or our community. What's your take on, I guess, you learning about these different cultures and things like that? Do you gain a voice over time, or is it not a fact that you gain that respect to say anything? Rather, what's your role? Are you an observer, a commenter, just a person in those matters? And second part is, you talked about how, yeah, we do have a hierarchy built on ethnicity and gender and things like that. Who should be at the core to help distribute that power to everyone equally? Who are the members of that core? Thank you.
Well, I want to ask you more about your first question, but on the second question, I certainly in the university classroom, which is the setting I'm most familiar with, it is the sort of the obligation of the professor to say, okay, insofar as we are entering into this seminar, talking about this text or set of texts or ideas, let us set aside the identities we value so highly in ordinary life, and try to enter into the understanding of the person we're reading. So I guess it's that person who is the arbiter in that kind of setting. Is that the kind of question you're asking?
It could be academic. I was hoping for more of a mundane, everyday life, every opportunity you would get, generalized question. Yeah, I open it up to all three of you if you guys can help.
I mean, I think one of the things that occurs to me is sort of the value that we place on disinterest, whether or not we're familiar with the word itself, right? But the value that we as a sort of polity place on it is readily apparent, I think, ideally, in our judicial system, right? Our judges are supposed to be disinterested. Our juries are tested for disinterest, right? They're selected for disinterest, or at least ideally that's what's in play, right? And so I think that might be one way of thinking about the value to which, or the value a disinterested point of view might bring to sort of public life or different ideas in different spaces. I think one of the challenges that you're facing, or that you've experienced, and that I think is an accurate reflection of the state of affairs, is that identities are often, minority identities are often called on as having, in the classroom at least, a particular expertise, right? So that if you've experienced X type of oppression, you can speak to this. And I think it really unfairly puts our underrepresented minority students in a position of pressure they shouldn't be facing. Right? It's like, if you're the only black man in the room, then please tell us how you feel about Othello. It's like, that's not fair, right? And so it's, I think, trying to remind people to pull away from that and asking, so why do we read these other things, right? Why are we reading or talking about these other things that aren't us? Why aren't we just reading our diaries aloud, right, in the classroom? That's not the project of the classroom, and I think it's just a matter of reframing the conversation to those more maybe easily accessible concepts or terms.
Thank you.
And by the way, ladies and gentlemen, the line is getting short. Do not let these panelists off the hook. Let's get enough questions up here.
Hello. A few things. I'm 60 years old. I still don't know what the totality of my identity is. Okay. On the concept of intersectionality, I'm not of the campus. I come over here on occasion. So I come over here and I hear words like space, intersectionality, and I'm like, everybody's using it as if it's something new. Years ago, we called it multidimensional. So it's not a new concept, but believe me, everybody's wrapped up into it and they think it's something entirely new. Okay, on to greater points. Some of you in the room will recall I was here when Mark was here. Mark was here a few years ago. Okay. And I had the same problem with Mark that I had with you guys. And the problem is an element which is not being addressed directly, which is a main component of the whole identity politics thing, is social power, political power, economic power. Okay, that is why the masses are saying, "Oh, I have been historically left behind, and when is my turn going to come?" If we maintain the status quo, the existing order, my turn may never come. Okay. So this power, you can talk about all this other, and I'm not dismissing the other issues concerned with identity. But I think at root, okay, is a power thing, and it, as articulated by many, this crisis of identity politics represents a threat to the status quo, a threat to the existing order, a threat to white privilege, white male privilege, black middle class privilege also. Okay, all right. Just those who are getting more than others or a disproportionate share of society's resources. Okay, and I don't think that's, with Mark, I told him, you can talk about all this other stuff, okay, but that's the core of this. Now, identity politics is not driving us apart. We were apart before the advent of identity politics. Okay, So the question is, we've been grappling with this since the advent of the civil rights movement, so to speak. Nobody has any solutions. Let me say, nobody has approaches that will please everybody. Okay. My point is, okay, my question is, so at this stage of the game, what are some of your suggested approaches that we go to improve the situation?
Well, let me speak to your original, or I think sort of your middle point, the question about power, or the observation about power, that this is all about power. And of course, you're right, it is about power. But I would also say that it is a question of justice as well, because when we're talking in intersectional terms or in big structural terms, we're talking about groups of people, classes of people, women, African Americans, lesbians, gay and lesbian, any number of categories. Okay, that may all be true to some extent, when we're talking about power and privilege on the structural level. But what happens when you are in an interview with a particular person who's sitting across the table from you who happens to be a member of that group? Is it just simply to say, because that person is a member of X group, he must hold these views, and I must treat him on the basis of those views in a certain way? And I would say that to do so is unjust. So to take the macro theory of intersectionality and then say, well, because you're this, I'm going to treat you as if you have already had privilege, that's not fair.
We should never, nobody should ever be prejudged. We know the result of assumptions, right? Should I say it? We know the assumptions make fools out of both you and me, so I don't assume anything about you. It's something that's very difficult to do, obviously.
I mean, I think if I can also speak to the issue of power for a second, I think you're right. It is about power, and the question, as I understand it, is how do we bring how do we create an aggregate of power that balances out what we may or may not understand as the other side, right? If we keep fractioning and splintering into ever smaller sectarian identity affinity groups, our power is going to be fractured. And I think this is what Obama did so brilliantly, and Mark has pointed this out, right, is that he didn't call out sort of individual groups repeatedly. He relied on a very simple rhetorical strategy, which is, yes, we can. Not yes, you can. Not yes, I can, but we, right? And sort of focusing on the vocabulary of being part of a community, assuming that you are part of a community that works across and includes identities in all of their varieties. I think that resulted in a lot of political power. And I think that's the way forward.
Well, if you don't persuade a majority, you need 50% plus one. That's what you need to get anything done anywhere, okay? That means framing your arguments in a way that can appeal to 50% plus one, all right? That's what that means. So if you're really interested in power, you won't be interested in identity politics because, as Mark Lilla, I think, demonstrates, identity politics is Reaganism for lefties. But you know what he means by that? He means a certain kind of very conservative social vision, which he identifies with Reaganism, is every tub on its own bottom. I'm okay. F you, Jack. It's your issues are not my issues. Take care of your own issues. Okay. And that just divides us up into these atoms, into these islands that are not connected to each other. Identity politics does that in a way too. There are many poor white people. I mean, I'll be repeating myself if I go on in this vein. I mean, J.D. Vance, Hillbilly Elegy, and what Matthew Desmond's Pulitzer Prize-winning book about housing insecurity in Milwaukee makes this point, I think, very graphically. Poor white people in trailer parks on one side of Milwaukee, poor black people in tenements on the other side of Milwaukee, and they all getting their stuff set on the sidewalk because they can't pay their rent, et cetera. You're running around talking about reparations. I mean, I understand why a Black Lives Matter advocate is talking about reparations. I don't understand why a presidential candidate who would hope to lead a progressive coalition is talking about reparations. How is that going to get 50% plus one, which is what you need in order to get anything done? So if you're really interested in power, You will eschew the intersectional view of the world, and you will look for a humanistic, transcendent view about what connects people together in terms of their basic human interests. But I don't think most of these people are really interested in power.
Okay, but I attracted people up here thinking that we'd have extra time. We got to get to them here.
My question, oh, this is really tall. I'm very short. My question is for Dr. Corey, but everyone feel free to respond on it. I had a question earlier, but I forgot it. But you mentioned in your commentary that that you saw kind of, if I'm mischaracterizing, please correct me, but that you saw there are some underlying goods with identity politics, but that you saw maybe like a transition period on where that is now characterized as more of a negative thing than a positive thing. And I was wondering if you'd be able to kind of comment on that.
Yeah, well, when I said that I saw some good, I mean, it is the case that the insight behind intersectionality, that people have more than one relevant identity characteristic, makes a whole lot of sense. I mean, in a certain sense, it's already what we think. You know, I'm a woman, I live here, I've got, you know, these allegiances. There are all these things that make up identity, and intersectionality makes that kind of explicit. There's nothing wrong with that. Where I criticize intersectionality is a lot like what Professor Loury has just said, that it does tend to make us choose one or a couple of those and then ally with people who hold that view with us, and then we are splintering into these ever smaller groups. It's really hard to get things done, because you might imagine, you know, that black lesbians have very different visions of the good from, I don't know, Hispanic lesbians. It's not the case that being further down on the intersectional continuum means that you're all going to have the same interests in common. Those interests can splinter, or the groups splinter, and then it's very hard to get the 50% plus one. So I think the insight of intersectionality is not wrong, but insofar as it's being used as a political club to harm your opponents, that it is not a good thing. Thank you.
I want to put in a word for intersectional scholarship while recognizing the legitimacy of many of the concerns raised by all the panelists. I've been in the academy for almost 50 years now, and I've seen a lot of changes. And a lot of the stuff that goes into intersectional theorizing, frankly, I don't get a lot out of that. You know, the fact that we have multiple identities and that they intersect in ways that can reinforce disadvantages, true, not a shocking insight. On the other hand, I now assign in my courses a lot of scholarship that presents itself as intersectional because it is presenting the voices and experiences of political actors, organizations, and groups that weren't in the curriculum when I entered the academy. It is telling me fascinating things about peoples and struggles and contests that I just didn't learn about before. And it is very hard to enter into imaginatively the experience of people who do not appear at all in the text you're reading or appear only in marginal or subordinated roles. That's a contribution that I think we should acknowledge and value. Do you agree?
Rogers, can I ask a follow-up question? Is that an intersectional aspect, or is that diversity?
I think that you can use either label. I just know that the intersectionality movement in scholarship has encouraged people to do primary research projects that for them is about intersectionality. I don't really care much about the label, but I am learning about how African American women's group helped fundraise for certain kinds of civil rights activities in the mid-20th century, and I just didn't know that before. And I think that's valuable, and they say we're doing it because it's intersectional scholarship. Again, the theoretical label I don't get a lot out of, but a lot of the scholarship, I think, makes a contribution, and I wouldn't want the message of this panel to be that anything that uses the label intersectionality is suspect. You made the point well, Elizabeth, about the value of Kim Crenshaw's original contribution in calling attention to a particular experience that was important. I just want to say that a lot of the empirical scholarship inspired by intersectionality does make concrete contributions. If you put it under the label of diversity, it's the same contribution. I'm not fighting over the label one way or the other.
So as I've, as you observe, you see things going on, you have thoughts, and I feel like recently I came to a point, so I want to put my thought before you for comment, because I've learned that's the best way for, to see what holes are in your thoughts or conclusions. I feel like one of the downsides of the identity, I forget beyond politics, just this claiming of identities, is that when we pick one aspect of our life and we elevate that in a sense to define who we are, you could pick any of the issues that's been out there today, is that then as soon as somebody doesn't agree with you or just holds a different viewpoint than you, what I see is that people say, if you don't agree with me, I am automatically offended. And I was trying to tease out the source of that severe, grievous offense, and it seems to me that it's because if you've claimed this as your identity and somebody doesn't agree with you, they've basically rejected what you're saying is the core of your being. And that's why, on a side note, I think it's so important that we do find the things that unite us or find our identity in something much broader than one aspect. But I guess my question is, is that some of it bothers me that what's out there is, as soon as you don't agree with me, I'm offended and conversation is shut down and you can't talk to me, because I think the conversation is important. What is the source of this offense? Is it that I've claimed this as my identity and in a sense you've rejected me, or do you see something else going on?
I think, well, I can't, that's a good question, and it's hard, and I think that's why we're all being quiet up here. But it does seem to me that this is something I mentioned briefly in my talk, that there are these assumptions that come with certain identities. For example, if you're a woman, you must be on board with women's issues as the majority or as the elite classes understand them. So that if somebody meets me and thinks, well, I'm a woman, so I must have certain views, and then I don't have those views, that's a troubling kind of determinism that goes with the identity. Or if I'm gay, you have all these assumptions about me on the basis of that. I think that's the source of the offense, that somehow, if you carry an identity, people assume things about you, and then if you don't have that identity, suddenly they're surprised. But we ought not to say that simply because we have an identity that we are likely to hold particular views. That's not a very clear answer to your question. It's a hard question.
I mean, what came to mind for me was something Yasha Monk said last night about sort of the rise of populism and the symptom of that being that one person claims to be sort of absolutely correct and then about an issue, and then anyone who disagrees is not just sort of different, right? It's the claim for exclusivity of rightness is such that anybody who disagrees isn't simply in disagreement, they're morally bankrupt, right? They're illegitimate, they are not part of that. I think there is a degree, like that same structure is at work in identity-based politics, because if you disagree with somebody who has foregrounded I am X and therefore Y, right, and you say but not Y, then you're saying by extension, well then you are not therefore X, right? There's a lot more at stake for somebody who's foregrounding their identity in that way than somebody who's foregrounding an idea separate from their identity. And so I think that defensive posture then that people take, right, is understandable as part of that.
Yep, I would like to thank, first of all, our excellent panelists. Thank you so much for taking on difficult issues. I'd also like to thank the audience for asking great questions, and to thank SCETL.